A 10/10 creature is absolutely massive. There simply aren't very many other creatures in Magic that can stand up to one. So if one is efficiently costed enough and has some abilities, it is an absolutely terrifying threat, one that needs to be dealt with immediately. As soon as a creature this big hits the board, the game completely warps around it. In all, there are 30 cards that are 10/10 creatures or that create a 10/10 creature token, and in this video we'll take a look at the 10 that have left the biggest impact on competitive Magic the Gathering. This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. Use the links in the description to visit their store. Before we get started, here's a quick reminder on how I rank cards in these videos. A first tier top 8 is worth 2 points. This includes events like Pro Tours, and a second tier top 8 is worth 1 point. This includes events like regional championships. At number 10, it's the Dragon. For 4 generic and 1 of each color of mana, it has flying, and whenever 1 or more dragons you control attack, you draw that many cards, and then you can put a permanent from your hand on the battlefield. When it's on the battlefield, your other dragon spells also cost 1 generic less to cast. That effect is also active if the Dragon is in your command zone, and while that part doesn't matter in 60 card formats, it does make the Dragon a very powerful commander since it has a big effect even before you cast it. But even in non-commander formats, the Dragon is still pretty sweet. Reducing the cost of dragons is nice, but it's that attack trigger, which counts itself, that really makes the Dragon a threat. Drawing at least 1 card and putting something directly on the board is pretty amazing, especially when you're also smashing in with a 10/10 flyer. Because it's from a commander set, the only 60 card formats it's legal in are Legacy and Vintage, and its 2 points have both come in the latter, where it's been played in Bazaar of Baghdad decks. These decks are typically landless apart from the Bazaar, which doesn't even produce mana, but it does have a powerful effect. You can tap it to draw 2 cards and discard 3. That sounds like card disadvantage, but when you discard a bunch of recursive creatures or creatures with madness that are free when you discard them, the downside becomes upside. In those decks, the Dragon is an occasional reanimation target, but because these decks are landless, the main purpose of the Dragon is actually to be exiled to pitch spells. Because it's all 5 colors, it can be thrown away to cast any pitch spell, like Force of Will or Unmask, for free. However, the Dragon hasn't put up any top 8 since 2020. At number 9, it's Colossus of Akros. It has the same score as the Dragon, but has a higher average finish in its 2 second tier top 8s, so I gave it a higher spot on the list. It's 8 generic mana and indestructible, which sounds like an amazing deal, but it also has Defender. However, you can pay 10 generic mana for a Monstrosity 10, which means that if the Colossus isn't already monstrous, it becomes monstrous and you put 10 +1/+1 counters on it, and when the Colossus is monstrous, it gains Trample and loses Defender. So once this is fully unlocked, it's an indestructible 20/20 with Trample. Obviously, casting this and turning it monstrous is no mean feat. However, there is one deck that is up to the challenge of producing enough mana, Devotion to Green. The Colossus has 1 top 8 each in Standard and Pioneer Devotion to Green, 8 years apart from one another. In both formats, these decks lean heavily on Nykthos Shrine to Nyx, which when combined with Mana Dorks and other ramp, makes it very possible to actually get the Colossus going. However, it doesn't have any top 8 since 2022. At number 8, it's Desolation Twin. If you think 1 10/10 just isn't enough, this is the card for you, because it's 10 generic for a 10/10 that makes a 10/10 colorless Eldrazi token when you cast it. One of the downsides of sinking a bunch of mana into a big creature is that your opponent might just be able to remove it and come out way ahead on mana when they do, but if you get 2 10/10s, 1 spot removal spell just isn't going to get the job done. All of the Twins' top 8s came in the Standard of 2015 and 2016, where it was played in green ramp decks. That Standard format had lots of great ramp, including Shrine of the Forsaken Gods, which is a land that produces extra mana to cast colorless spells, as well as Explosive Vegetation and Nissa's Renewal, so getting to 10 mana in these decks was actually doable. However, Desolation Twin doesn't have any top 8 since rotating out of Standard. At number 7, it's Apex Altisaur. For 7 generic and 2 green, when this 10/10 enters, it fights up to 1 target creature you don't control. And it has Enrage, which means whenever it gets damaged, it does something. In this case, it fights another creature you don't control. Because fight effects generally mean the Altisaur gets damaged, it can often come down and fight multiple times, and because it's an up to effect, you You can choose not to have it fight something once it's taken too much damage, but it's also very possible for it to fight like 4 things without dying because it's a 10/10. One that can remove a whole bunch of stuff from your opponent's board. It's from a commander set, so the only 60 card formats it's legal in are Legacy and Vintage, and all of its top 8s have come in the former, and always in decks that use natural order, like Elves. This powerful spell lets you sacrifice a green creature to tutor up a green creature and put it directly on the battlefield. Even with just a little bit of fast mana, you can easily get this going on turn 3, and it probably destroys all of your opponent's creatures when you do. So far, the Altisaur doesn't have any top 8s in 2025, but it's a pretty sweet card to search up with natural order, so I'm not ready to count it out entirely. At number 6, it's Metalwork Colossus. It has a base cost of 11 generic mana, but rarely actually costs that much, because it costs X less to cast, where X is the total mana value of non-creature artifacts you control. You can also sacrifice 2 artifacts to return it from your graveyard to your hand. In the right deck, it's pretty easy to cast a cheap Colossus, and the fact it's a 10/10 that has a very doable way to bring it back is likely to put a lot of fear into your opponent. Since this card's all about artifacts, it shouldn't come as a surprise that the Colossus's points have all come in artifact decks, and it's put up top 8s in 3 separate formats. In particular, in decks leaning hard on non-creature artifacts. The Colossus combines especially nicely with mana rocks, since they can produce mana to cast it and lower the cost of the Colossus itself. It's also pretty sweet in prison decks like Stacks, which deploy a bunch of non-creature artifacts to lock the opponent out of the game. The Colossus gives those decks a very real win condition. However, it doesn't have any top 8 since 2022. At number 5, it's the Tarrasque. For 6 generic and 3 green, this 10/10 has haste and ward 10 as long as it was cast, and whenever it attacks, it fights target creature defending player controls. If you can manage to cast this, it's pretty impressive, since ward 10 is pretty close to equivalent to hexproof. Your opponent just isn't going to have 10 generic extra mana to pay to target this huge dinosaur, and if it has haste, that also means you'll get a fight the turn it comes down. One thing to note is that the Tarrasque's fight effect isn't optional like the Altisaur's was, but it's so big that that usually isn't a problem. It is a little sad, though, that you don't get this thing at full power if you reanimate it or grab it with natural order. That means that this is really only worth playing in decks that are great at producing massive amounts of mana. The Tarrasque has seen play in the aforementioned Pioneer Devotion to Green decks, but it's seen the most play in Modern, where it sometimes appears in Amulet of Vigor decks. These decks use bounce lands in the Amulet to produce lots of mana. This is possible because when something like Growth Chamber enters with the Amulet in play, it untaps, giving you a chance to tap it for mana before bouncing anything. Combine that with cards that give you extra land drops like Azusa, and you can produce up to 6 mana with only a single land by bouncing the same one every time you use up a land drop. However, the Tarrasque doesn't have any top 8s anywhere since 2023. At number 4, it's Apex Devastator. For 8 generic and 2 green, this 10/10 cascades 4 times. Whenever you cast a spell with Cascade, you exile cards from the top of your library until you exile a non-land card that costs less, and you can cast that card without paying its mana cost. This does that 4 times, which means you're going to end up with 5 spells for your 10 mana, including this huge Hydra, and no matter what those spells are, there's a good chance you're coming out way ahead. It also means counter magic and spot removal usually aren't enough to stop the Devastator from, well, devastating your opponent because of all that value. Because Cascade triggers when you cast it, that means, like the Tarrasque, using natural order or reanimation to put this into play isn't really worth it, as you just get a vanilla 10/10. However, that doesn't mean there's no way to cheat this into play, as if you use effects that let you cast it without paying its mana cost, you're still going to get all those Cascade triggers. The Devastator's points have all come in a wacky but powerful legacy deck built around Creative Technique, which lets you cast the top non-land card in your library without paying its mana cost. Every single non-land in the deck is either a Creative Technique, a really sweet card to cast for free, like Emrakul, or a card with Cascade, like the Devastator. Generally, this means if you cast Creative Technique, you're going to cast every single creature in the deck, which results in a board full of big, scary creatures. Eventually, you get Maelstrom Wanderer and attack with your board of Devastators and the like, because now they all have haste. This deck looks like it's going to continue to be successful in Legacy going forward, but the top 3 cards on the list are in a tier of their own because they have such a big lead on everything else, so number 4 may be the maximum for Apex Devastator. Speaking of Apex Devastator, I know I'm going to be devastated if you don't subscribe to the channel. I'm trying to hit 100,000 subscribers this year, so if you're enjoying this video, do me a favor and help me reach my goal. I put out lots of Magic content every single week, so you won't regret it. At number 2, it's Ulamog the Infinite Gyre. We've seen some big creatures so far, but the Eldrazi Titans really brought new meaning to the word big in Magic when they were printed in Rise of the Eldrazi. People simply hadn't seen a creature this big that was this pushed, so Eldrazi like Ulamog really changed the game. Anyway, Ulamog is 11 mana for a 10/10 with Annihilator 4, which means that when it attacks, your opponent has to sacrifice 4 permanents. It also destroys a permanent when you cast it and is indestructible. Also, when it's put into your graveyard from anywhere, its owner shuffles their graveyard back into their library. This ability really limits the ways in which you can reanimate Ulamog, but it also has the added benefit of being a card that makes it near impossible for a mill deck to beat you. So even if your opponent manages to kill Ulamog, which is a tall order, they will still be down a permanent, and if they don't manage to kill Ulamog before an attack, the game is pretty much over, as Annihilator will dismantle their board, something that is particularly problematic when you're also being swung at by a 10/10. Like many of the cards on the list, Ulamog has often been used as a ramp win condition. While in Standard it was played in Eldrazi Green, in Modern it's played in Tron decks, and in Legacy it's found success in Cloudpost. It's also been used in Modern decks that use Goryo's Vengeance and Through the Breach. Both of these let you put Ulamog into play early in the game, and while they only let you swing a single time, Annihilator 4 in the early game will usually make your opponent restart the game at 0 permanents or pretty close to it, and they're also taking 10 damage. Goryo's Vengeance even gets around the fact that Ulamog shuffles itself into the library when it goes to the graveyard because it's an instant, meaning you can reanimate it in response to the trigger. However, these days it has slowed down in a big way, as lots of newer Eldrazi, including the Modern Horizons 3 version of Ulamog, have started to see play instead of this Ulamog. Now, it's probably not done entirely, but it only put up a few top 8s in 2024 and doesn't have any so far in 2025, so it's unlikely to ever catch the cards in front of it. At number 2, it's Progenitus. For 2 mana of each color, this 10/10 comes with protection from everything, and if you would put it into a graveyard from anywhere, you reveal it and shuffle it into its owner's library instead. Protection from everything is awesome, and means that nothing can block damage, enchant, or target Progenitus, making it so that only a narrow number of removal spells can actually deal with it, and that's really scary when we're talking about an unblockable 10/10. With a mana cost like this, you've probably guessed that people don't normally try to cast this thing. Notably, this shuffle trigger is different from Ulamog's because Ulamog still goes to the graveyard, and then there's a window for you to respond. Progenitus never makes it to the graveyard. It just gets revealed and shuffled back into your deck. So no Goryo's Vengeance shenanigans are allowed here. It also doesn't have the anti-mill upside to the same degree, since it only shuffles itself. However, even if graveyard stuff isn't possible here, there are other ways to get Progenitus into play early. For example, in Extended, this was accomplished with Hypergenesis. In Modern, it's been achieved with Indomitable Creativity, and in Vintage, it's been done with Oath of Druids. However, Progenitus has put up the most top 8s by far in Legacy, whereas with some of the other cards on the list, it's most frequently achieved with Natural Order. In addition to top 8s in decks that look to cheat Progenitus into play, it's also cheaped some top 8s in decks that play Progenitus just because of its enormous mana value. In both Modern and Legacy, it's been played in Infect decks that look to use Blazing Shoal and exile Progenitus from your hand to give an Infect creature +10/+0 as early as turn 2, which means they can end the game in a single swing without paying any mana. So they can even protect the creature with counter magic. That type of combo ultimately got the Shoal banned in Modern, so Progenitus has played this role more in Legacy. Progenitus is going to continue to put up top 8s in Legacy, but the number 1 card on this list will remain number 1 for the foreseeable future. And that card is Ulamog the Ceaseless Hunger. That's right, Ulamog has 2 cards on this list. This one comes from this Eldrazi Titan's second appearance in Battle for Zendikar. For 10 generic mana, this indestructible 10/10 exiles 2 target permanents when you cast it, and when it attacks, the defending player exiles the top 20 cards of their library. This Ulamog's cast trigger is insane, and usually means the best your opponent can do against this Eldrazi is get 3 for 1, and the attack trigger is pretty great too, because it means even if your opponent can keep from taking damage, they're probably dead in 2 or 3 swings since you'll obliterate their library. This is, of course, another hard to cast creature, but there are always ways to get these things into play. For example, in Standard it was cheated into play using Aetherworks Marvel, which importantly lets you cast the card, so you even get the cast trigger. The Marvel eventually got banned because the combo was so powerful. Meanwhile, in Historic, Pioneer, Modern, and Legacy, there are decks that have looked to ramp this indestructible monster into play, and in all of those formats this is accomplished with powerful lands. All in different kinds of decks we talked about so far, like Devotion to Green, Tron, and Cloudpost decks. Ulamog is simply one of the best things you can cast in many Magic formats, and that's going to allow it to continue to amass points, especially in Modern and Legacy, so it's only going to tighten its hold on the #1 spot on this list. So those are Magic's top 10 10/10 creatures. If you want to own any of these absolutely massive creatures, check out the description, where you can find a direct Card Kingdom link for each card that appeared in the video. If you want to make sure you catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. If you want to catch up on past MTG top 10s, and there are almost 850 of them, you should see a playlist on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.